series. My name is Christina Alfonso, and I will be your session host and moderator. We ask that participants keep microphones and videos off for the remainder of the session, unless specifically asked to turn them on by a presenter. Please note that if you are bumped out of the meeting due to internet connection or bandwidth, please log back into the meeting. You are attending session L056, Intentional Coaching to ensure teacher support actions best meet the needs of teachers and students in virtual lessons. Allow me to introduce our presenters today, Vicki Condolari and Laura Rosell from NIT. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So we are proud to be here today and welcome to this session. It is going to be jam-packed and full of great information that you can use right away. Just a couple of norms. I'm hoping that everyone today will have fun and engage with us in the chat and participate. Have your handouts ready. We have 3 handouts that we'll be using in today's session. We'll be using the NIT Companion Tool. We'll be using a weekly lesson guide, handout 2, and handout 3 is a note catcher that we'll be using during some of our virtual field trips that we'll be taking during our time together. So we're looking forward to today's adventure. Just a couple of vocabulary words I want to put in your pocket for a little bit later. We're going to refer to at some point synchronous. And when we say synchronous, what we're referring to is that live teacher and student interaction engagement happening online, kind of that live kind of look at online learning and teaching. And then asynchronous, which is really on your own, where students are on their own, supported in activities and things that they're doing as follow-up or as assignments that teachers have provided to them, although they do get support. So I just wanted to start with that. And with that little note, we'll get started on looking at our session objectives. Laura Roussel and I are together here. I am Vice President of Services for NIT, and Laura is our Director of School Services. So we are so happy. Been 10 years since she and I presented together. So it's a thrill today. Our session objectives. So today we're going to be digging into that companion tool, that NIT companion tool for virtual learning. And this is an excellent tool to leverage in order to support teachers and to provide feedback to teachers so that they can increase their instructional proficiency in a virtual space. Also, we're going to really dig into how teacher feedback can be used to ensure that instructional practices are strong, because that's important whether virtual or face-to-face. And then next, we're going to be able to use targeted teacher feedback and support to ensure that student achievement happens. And that's what's important for us to keep in mind. Our session agenda. Today, our session agenda, we're looking at that companion tool. We'll dig in. We'll make sure that you have a chance to kind of familiarize yourself with it. We'll also talk a little bit about planning for virtual instruction, what that looks and sounds like. And we'll also get into some action. We'll actually get in to see what virtual instruction looks like on that field trip that we're going to take. And then we're going to create a bite-sized action step with the beautiful Laura Roussel guiding us through that to know what that should look like when you're giving that feedback to a teacher. And then, of course, we'll reflect, because when you reflect, you learn, and we'll make some connections. So it's a jam-packed agenda for sure.
So great. I'm excited to be here with you all. Like Vicki said, it's been a while since her and I have been able to spend some time growing and learning and sharing together, but I am excited about this topic today. And I really wanted to spend a little bit of time before I start diving into this and talk about that whole concept of intentional coaching. In our title, we talk about that intentional coaching, which means deliberate, or planned ahead. And so I want to get our minds framed as coaches. I see 411 coaches, 412 as the number grows in our participants. And whether you are an administrator, whether you are a district leader, we're going to all consider ourselves coaches today. And so I want you to think about these statements that Diane Sweeney has said often before. And as you think about these, I want you to think about what extent you might agree or disagree with these statements. It's really important for us as we dive into the next few slides together in this learning today that you frame your coaching mindset. And so some of the things that Diane Sweeney has referred to is, coaching is not about fixing people. That coaching is a partnership. It's about student learning, and it fits within a robust system of professional learning. So today, as we talk about that concept of intentional coaching and how you as an instructional leader, no matter what position you're in, frame yourself as a coach, I want you to really think about the extent of where you might fall in these statements. In addition to, those statements and thinking about framing ourselves, I want us to think about the second part of that title. That intentional coaching is the first part, but that second part is really about ensuring that our teacher support actions really support teacher and student in virtual lessons. They support their needs. So today I want to really talk about three things. We're going to focus our conversation today as coaches on building goal clarity, how we can positively impact student achievement, and enhancing effective instructional practices through the right action step. And so whether we're coaching face-to-face, whether we're coaching in a virtual modality, or whether our teachers are teaching face-to-face, or whether our teachers are teaching in a virtual modality, thinking about how these three pieces that we're going to talk today to you about will really enhance your intentional coaching and frame your coaching so that you're getting results.
And that's so important, as Laura shared with us, to keep those things in mind about that targeted intentional feedback. And as we help teachers and support our teachers and ourselves in our ability to coach, we have a tool at NIT, a companion tool that is super helpful in this space of really being able to navigate that virtual learning and teaching. And so this tool is designed to support you guys as you're moving into supporting your teachers. So we're going to take a little look at this today. It is handout 1. You have that, and we're going to dig into really the planning portion of it. And Laura's going to lead us through a couple of things in a moment to kind of look at as you're exploring this tool. But one of the things we know is when we're shifting from something that feels familiar to something new, we often have to begin with that planning piece. So this tool is designed to help you as you're helping your teachers kind of move into that space.
So I want us to talk a little bit about that tool. So if you have that handout, that's handout 1. And just like whenever we are supporting teachers, first-year teachers in their, as they are teaching face-to-face, I want us to think about how new maybe some of this virtual teaching has been for many of us. And although we know there are many similarities in how we plan for instruction, no matter if it's face-to-face or in a virtual modality, I want us to think about the first place that we go to with teachers when we're supporting them is with the planning. So I really want to talk about that piece as we dive in. We are going to use an online lesson from a teacher, a virtual lesson that a teacher has taught as sort of our context to drive our context today as we talk to you about this concept of intentional coaching. So I want you just to take a few minutes on handout 1 and look on pages 8 and 9. Pages 8 and 9 really focus on the planning portion, the instructional plans. And so whenever you think about, if those of you who are familiar with our NIT rubric, this companion tool, as Vicki had said earlier, is divided into those 3 overarching domains. We have our instruction domain, we have our planning domain, and we have our environment domain. But as we begin to think about that intentional coaching, we want to start with you with the planning piece. So I'd like for you to open up your handout to pages 8 and 9. And I want you to look at that exemplary, that first column, that exemplary column that comes directly from our NIT teaching standards. And then in the center column, you can see some virtual strategies that might be used. as you look at those, I want you just to take a few minutes to notice some similarities and some differences. So for example, under instructional plans, I see that it talks about the standards, and it also talks about the objectives. Well, whether or not we're in a face-to-face lesson or whether or not we're in a virtual lesson, we know good instruction is centered around standards-based and connected, and also communicating those objectives. So that would be something that would be similar. But there are some instances where I may notice a difference. For example, if we're talking about that criteria or that exemplar work, even though we know that in a face-to-face lesson, we would be planning for that and maybe showing that in a certain way, in a virtual lesson, we might have to think about utilizing a folder that students can access so that they can return to that exemplar throughout the lesson. Or we might have to think about what virtual strategy we might use so that our students can become familiar with the exemplars. So although there are many similarities between that face-to-face instruction and that virtual instruction, there are also some differences. So before we get started, I really wanted you to begin to think about what are those similarities and what are those differences. Throughout the course of this particular presentation, we're going to be referring to these NIT K-12 teaching standards and this companion tool for virtual learning. So as we think about our teacher, our upcoming teacher, I want you just to think real quick, what are some similarities and some differences that you might notice between that face-to-face and that virtual teaching? And if you have a chance, send a few chats. If not, you can just put it in your head. But if you have a chance, chat just a few of those similarities and differences that you might notice. And Vicki and I will just take a few minutes to watch those chats come in.
All right, so some people are already beginning, Laura, to notice some things, some different class management techniques I'm seeing come into the chat box. I'm seeing the alignment to standards and differentiated activities is something folks are noticing, similarities and differences there, for sure. Totally agree, right?
Excellent, good. So I heard Jenny said that pre-planning is key. And so really, as we begin to think about and make connections to that whole concept of intentional coaching, I wanted to sort of get your brain moving and that cognitive Velcro ready for you as we begin to think and dive into the next portion of this lesson, really using this planning domain to begin to gauge our coaching conversations. And then we're going to dive into the actual instructional domain as we watch this teacher engage with her students virtually.
So one of the things, Laura, that we're going to be pulling up and looking at is handout 2. And we're going to be making some comparisons and some notes of things that perhaps we noticed in the companion tool that now we're seeing in a weekly lesson guide, because here in Louisiana, we are using guidebooks in many of our schools and districts as Tier 1 curriculum. And so this would be something that would support the teacher that we're going to see in her planning and in her preparation for her week's lessons. So as you look at handout 2, you can see there that it is a lesson, just adding to the lesson plan a little bit here and there. And one of the things that this teacher is struggling with or trying to provide for her students is the gaps that have occurred due to the absence from school and due to the differences in students, trying to fill a couple of gaps. So one of the things in her intentional coaching session that has taken place was to make sure that you're scaffolding or providing opportunities for students to be able to fill those gaps. And so as you look at this, as you think about making sure that those goals are clear and there's clarity, see what similarities or things that you're noticing that this teacher is doing just take and jot a little note. Maybe you noticed it on the companion guide that this teacher is doing in this little weekly lesson guide or notes as she prepares to teach from Macbeth in the guidebooks. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to take a quick look. So as you're looking, you might be like me and Laura's, we've had this conversation around what are some things we noticed. We were noticing that there's a lot of opportunity in here for differentiation. We're noticing that the objectives are leveled because there was a gap in unfinished learning. So they've been leveled here to match the standard so that that teacher has some additional knowledge about what might need to be reviewed. We noticed too that there's an asynchronous little support or scaffold that's listed in the plan, referencing a May 6th recording that would be used in that on your own teaching experience. That was referenced in the companion tool. And we noticed, as Laura and I kind of reviewed this, we noticed a mini lesson was being conducted by the teacher to kind of fit between, you know, as they're prepping up for that culminating writing activity within this unit of study from guidebooks. So you're probably making some additional notations that you might have picked up on that are happening in this particular lesson guide.
Good, Vicki. And many of them are noticed in the prerequisite skills and that scaffolding, and then the performance tasks are embedded at that level.
Yes, and those are ways that this teacher is planning maybe a little extra for those gaps, those learning gaps, and also to prepare to engage her students. Because as many of you noticed, engagement in a virtual environment can look very different than engagement in a face-to-face or traditional setting. And sometimes, you know, as we're watching for students, those things are hard to see in a virtual lesson that we can maybe see face-to-face. So those are things she's looking at to ensure that there's goals. Those goals are clear for students and so that she knows what to look for.
Excellent. So earlier I had highlighted those three kind of concepts that I wanted us to think about when we're thinking of intentional coaching. And this, what we really want to dive into right now is how we as coaches really build that goal clarity with our teachers. And so we're about to watch a video clip, and Miss Condolari, Vicki Condolari, has had the opportunity to coach this particular teacher. And as she's coaching this particular teacher, she is really being intentional and deliberate about helping that teacher to sort of showcase those things that she noticed in that lesson plan. And as you heard Vicki talking about all of those different things that she saw in that lesson plan, her questions are really going to guide the teacher in thinking about that goal clarity. So that's step one in being an intentional coach, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's in that virtual modality, you're really helping that teacher to build that clarity about what the goals for students are.
Excellent.
So as we're going to have a clip for you, I'm going to let you watch Vicki in action with this teacher. And because it was virtual, it was via Zoom. And so she's talking to this teacher about her lesson plan, just like many of you, the reality of what you've probably been doing over the course of the last few months and what may continue to do. And I want you as an intentional coach to think about these three things as you watch this interaction between the coach and the teacher. How will students know and understand their learning goals? So really pay attention to how the coach really has the teacher think about this. What will students produce, and how does the teacher intentionally plan to support student difficulties? And you'll see on handout 3, we have these questions listed for you, and this is a good place for you to jot some notes as you watch this particular segment, this coaching session. I also would encourage you to use this as a coach for any future coaching sessions that you have. These are great questions for you to use in the future as you're thinking about building that goal clarity with teachers as you help them to think about the needs of their students. So Vicki, I'm going to go ahead and pull up this video.
Okay, and I had a little question in the chat box while Laura's pulling those up. These questions are listed on handout 3 that you'll be just jotting a few notes as you watch this little intentional coaching session, a little pre-planning session, and they were also on the slide. Some viewers were wondering, Laura, so we're gonna pull that up for you and we'll just take a few notes as we watch.
And then you're going to provide a lot of opportunities for student thinking and work sharing. You talked about the questioning time, the breakout rooms, the check-ins, the opportunities for scaffolding, watching their responses on the whiteboard. So as you continue to think of about this particular lesson that we're going to be involved in and I'm going to observe, how will students know and understand the learning goal? What are some things that you're going to be doing to ensure that they understand that learning goal for the lesson?
I'm going to use several methods, several different types of ways to make sure that that learning goal is both clear and to repeat it often and redundant, both synchronously and asynchronously. So what I'm thinking is I'll have the oral and visual component, right, in my live class lesson. I'll also be able to share the exemplar of the culminating writing task and we'll, like I say, really go through it. I will also do a rubric review to that end on Wednesday, where students will be able to see what my exact expectations are and how the exemplar kind of breaks down into those particular rubric items and criteria and shape how I grade. I also want to make sure that I give that, that rubric and that exemplar asynchronously as well as synchronously so that my students will be able to refer back to it whenever they're working on it, because there is a large component of this writing task that will probably need to be done independently.
Excellent. So providing them both opportunities when you're teaching and they're live there with you, you're engaging them to see that exemplar, to have opportunities to use the rubric to kind of look at how that might be scored or the components of it. But then you're saying that you also want to make sure that that's included in the asynchronous or when they're kind of on their own so they can go back to it.
Exactly.
Excellent, excellent. So it's all related back to that standard as you're approaching the end of the school year and you've been working with Macbeth for a little bit of time. And so really aiming for that level 3 objectives, which is really tied to the DOK, the depth of knowledge.
Yes.
So as you think about this, what will students produce that's aligned to that learning goal?
Yeah, so just following with the guidebook, I'm going to have students write a short literary analysis of Macbeth, in particular looking at characterization and how characterization throughout a text, through each of the major plot points, influences and shapes a theme.
So what do you anticipate as you think about your students? Because you talked about how you looked at their student work and you've looked even at some of those benchmarks or those things that really showed you their data and where they were in their thinking. Where do you anticipate that your students might struggle as you go into this lesson?
Well, just looking at, like you said, my benchmark data as well as my exit tickets from the previous week when I kind of pre-assessed on this again, because we did it in semester 1, but it's been a minute. I noticed that students have still some trouble determining a theme. So that's kind of the base level skill that they need to do well on this. So I felt like we're going to need to stop and maybe do some additional practice review on theme, specifically kind of hitting back on those level 1 and 2 objectives to get students ready for that culminating writing task.
So you saw some confusion and you saw it not, in a couple of places. So you wanted to make sure you brought that back like as a little like mini lesson.
Yeah.
to incorporate it so that kids would have the opportunity just to kind of beef up their understanding on theme before they jump into this culminating writing task.
Right, and that's where slime comes in too, because slime is a nice way to break down how to find theme into a couple of steps, which I think will really help students who maybe struggle going from the big, the summary, this is the entire play, to this is the distilled message that the play had to say about, power or ambition.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I look forward to observing the lesson. Thank you for your time of walking me through kind of the whole planning process here. And after the lesson, we'll pull the student work and we'll really look to see that kids were able to take away some nuggets from that little mini lesson on theme.
Okay. I enjoy always talking with teachers, but I have to give just a little Mama Bear shout out. That is my daughter, who is a teacher. And so I've had the opportunity to actually observe her in teaching and learning with her students. So I just had to throw that in, just a one short Laura Little Mama moment. So as you guys kind of think through some things that maybe you noticed, I wanted to give you a chance just to kind of maybe jot any other notes you might want to have, or if you want to jot us a quick note in the chat box about something you noticed about that conversation with May around the lesson that she was planning to teach. Just go ahead and jot us a note. Laura's bringing us back on in. She is amazing. So let's see. Oh, thank you, other proud moms out there. Yeah, I appreciate that. Just go ahead and chat as you have maybe a thought about something you noticed about the conversation, and maybe around some of the difficulties maybe that that May was trying to avoid or trying to fill those and filling those gaps for students. It's so important for teachers, for us as teachers, to have this opportunity to actually talk with a colleague and have an intentional conversation. I see that Sholanda is speaking about the data, that she heard the data and really tying back to the assessments. Some folks are noticing that there was a particular thinking strategy that May incorporated to enhance, not take away from guidebooks, just to enhance and help students be able to connect. Yes, and folks are noticing the exemplars. That was one thing that May really did appreciate, was the fact that she had the opportunity to think about what engagement strategies, what visuals might she use. It just gave her a little extra in addition to her annotations. Laura, what are some things you were maybe noticing? Laura always notices so many things when she's observing a conversation. She coaches me all the time. So I'm wondering maybe her thoughts here.
Yeah. So one of the things that we really wanted you to pay attention to as you were watching this particular coaching segment is how the coach, Vicki, is coaching her daughter, May, who is a teacher, really to think about what the goals of that lesson were. And I think sometimes as instructional leaders and coaches, we forget that, even though we are in this new modality, this new virtual modality, really helping teachers to not get too focused on that modality and not lose sight of what do we want our students to learn today and how are we going to learn that. And so I think that these three key questions that Vicki had May reflect on: how will students know and understand their learning goals? What will students produce? And how does the teacher intentionally plan these difficulties? Really had May thinking about that planning piece.
And that's so important, Laura. We always see in research how critical it is as we're getting adjusted to kind of this, as you say, new modality, that we have the opportunity to have some coaching and feedback and just having that discussion point. It's really important. So as we kind of start to shift and think a little bit more deeply, not only about the goals and making sure that those goals come forward in our teaching, whether it's face-to-face or whether it is virtually, we need to think about why shifting the focus of coaching from teachers to students is so important. You know, oftentimes, even as if many of you are evaluators, you've noticed that tendency to want to kind of cling to what the teacher is saying and doing. And sometimes that's tricky, right? I mean, because you really want to see what impact or what's happening with the kids. How are they receiving it? And so as you think about the virtual space and virtual learning, it becomes even more important for us to pay attention to students and to plan for the engagement for our kids so that we're ensured that they are doing the thinking, that they are doing the problem solving, that they are engaging with us. And as May says, with 45 high school students joining her class, sometimes a little sleepy, it's important to make sure that you're keeping those things in check. So as we move into the next piece, we're going to really think about some questions again and think about how to ensure that students are able to engage with us. Laura?
Yes. So earlier we really talked about, you know, those three kind of overarching concepts whenever we're thinking about that intentional coaching. That first one was building that goal clarity. And we just saw Vicki do that using those three questions, really talking to the teacher about what are the goals of this particular lesson? What are we going to see students doing? And now I want us to think about, you know, really having that teacher to focus on positively how they're going to positively impact student achievement during that lesson. And so what we're going to do is we are going to watch a short snippet of May's lesson. She, as you know, when you saw in that lesson plan, she was really talking about that concept of theme using Macbeth as her story, as her context. And we're going to watch a short 8-minute clip of this. And as you're watching, remember you're in the seat of that coach, no matter what your position is, whether you're a coach, a teacher leader, a fellow teacher down the hall, an administrator, a district leader. You're really thinking about how you can help your teachers stay focused on those learning pieces and be intentional even in this virtual modality. And so as we watch May's lesson, she is going to be teaching using Blackboard, and we've had a chance to video her. I want you to think about these three questions. And it's found on handout 3. How did students demonstrate understanding? So I want you to think about the different ways that she had her students demonstrate. How did the presentation of content enhance that student understanding? And what was a strength that you were able to see in this little short snippet? So I want you to put your sort of your shoes on in this new virtual world. This might be how many of you will be watching, teaching, and learning. If we're not able to watch it in our brick and mortar buildings. And so thinking about, we're really not looking at the technology. She's teaching in the technology world. We are still focused on what tools is she using that's positively impacting students in this particular lesson clip. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up that clip, and I want you, as you watch this clip, to use handout 3 as a viewing guide so that you can think of what she might be doing that's actually helping her students to demonstrate their understanding, and then what would that overall strength of this lesson be. And I'm going to be using that NIT companion tool, handout 1, to really frame what that strength of this lesson might be. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up.
And, you know, as Laura's pulling that up, I've got to say, you know, there's a lot of different things we have to do in this virtual space at one time. And it's a skill set. And I just have to thank my partner for taking that on. And she's doing an amazing job pulling these things up. So we've got our listening ears on, and here we go.
Let's see how you're feeling with it so far. So how are you feeling about theme? Developing it, or finding it, talking about it? How's your understanding coming along? Let's rate ourselves. Yeah, how are you feeling about it so far? the pointer. Wherever you kind of feel you are. All right, so it looks like we're feeling pretty good about it. Let's kind of turn the tables here and start talking a little about Macbeth. So, you remember how they said in the video that finding pictures, thinking about topics, we just did that, right? I want to think about something that you remember seeing a lot of in Macbeth. But what else did y'all see? So think back to Macbeth. I'm going to take you back into last week for a minute. What was something we saw? So witches, jealousy, definitely. What was something else that y'all saw in Macbeth? Anger. Macbeth got real angry a couple of times, right? Yeah, what else? Determination. Yeah, Macbeth was pretty determined, right, to get what he wanted. We could call that also maybe ambition. He had lofty goals he was determined to achieve. Friendship. Yeah, the one with Banquo. It didn't end too well for him, did it? Ooh, loyalty. Yeah, like the soldiers who were deserting Macbeth at the end of the story. Yeah, totally. So we've got a lot of good ideas on the board, y'all. A lot of rich topics that we could dive into for Macbeth. So let's talk about what we're going to do with some of this. So we found some patterns. Let's go ahead. I'm going to skip ahead a little. It seems like we've kind of got the idea here. So we're going to talk about Macbeth and some of its themes. Now, here are a few that I pulled up, and a lot of what we came up with kind of falls into this. So I want you to look at this list. It's kind of based off of things that, we already said. If you had another one you like, you can throw it on the board too. Like Miss Waddles, I really liked Madness. Maybe we could put that one as well. I want you to grab your pointer and put your pointer on a word or a topic that y'all thought was interesting that we talked about. So what is one that grabbed your interest? Was it ambition, guilt, deception, fate and free will, gender roles, violence? What did you like? Oh, I see interest all over. I love it. Yeah, what caught your eye? We're going to talk through a few today. I'm going to have you help me. I can pick one again. Democracy is alive and well for a moment. Let me give you 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. I'm from Louisiana, Patrick. All right, so I think got the most votes for guilt. So we're going to start with that one. Let's do it. So you're going to do this no matter what theme you pick, but we're going to start with guilt just to show you how it works. What happened in Macbeth where we saw guilt? Where did we see guilt in Macbeth? Whatever theme you pick, you're going to have to think this part through. So, what happened in Macbeth relating to guilt? Throw it on the board or in chat. Yeah, what do you remember happening with guilt? Who felt guilty? Well, we have Miss Waddle's example, right, of Macbeth feeling guilty about killing Macbeth's family. Yeah, not long after Macbeth murdered the king, he was regretting it big time. Who else felt guilty? Yeah, I'm in the South. Awesome, thank you, Kenya. Thank you, Nicholas. Excellent. So let's see. So when Macbeth killed King Duncan, he felt guilty. He broke down in front of Lady Macbeth, right? Oh, my keyboard. It suddenly got disconnected. I'm going to throw what y'all have, though. I'm missing that a lot, too, right now. All right. And Macbeth was also guilty. That's a good point. So we saw guilt a lot. Now we know how guilt kind of works. What lesson do you think they're trying to teach us? So again, we're looking at the L in slime. So we thought about what happens. We picked our subject. Now, what are they telling us about guilt? All right, what are they trying to tell us about guilt? So think about like this one. The author is trying to teach us that what? Is guilt a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What causes people to feel guilty? Guilt can drive you mad. Ooh, I like that, Jacob. Man up. Well, but that has something to do with funerals too, Austin. I like the connection because every time Macbeth was feeling guilty, Lady Macbeth was like, come on, be a man. You can do this. Right? Glory can get into someone's head and make them commit horrible deeds. You'll always have to live with your guilt. It never goes away. Yes, y'all, you got the idea. And all of these guys could be themes, right? Like doing evil deeds leading to a lifetime of guilt. Guilt never goes away. Guilt can drive people mad. These things I'm highlighting on the board, these look like themes. These are pearls of wisdom Macbeth is trying to show us about guilt. Okay. What we're going to do for the weekly writing prompt 12 is pick a single sentence, right? A single theme. About Macbeth. Okay, so it can be one we talked about in class today. It could be one that kind of maybe you come up with. But one theme in Macbeth is that what? I want to know what you think.
Okay. All right, Laura's getting us back up to speed here.
Okay, so as you think about those 3 questions that we had you analyzing as you were watching that short lesson clip, of course, that lesson was much longer than what we saw. We were able to see 8 minutes of that clip. I want you just to spend a few minutes, maybe you can send through chat one of the answers to one of the questions that we had. So maybe it was, how did students demonstrate understanding? Maybe it was a quick response to how the presentation of the content enhanced that student understanding, or maybe it was the third one. What did you notice as an overall strength of this particular lesson or what this teacher was doing?
Yeah, so we're seeing people really responding. We're seeing things about scaffolding and student engagement, the importance of that in that virtual space. Also, Laura, I noticed that some folks were thinking too a little bit about the different content areas and how those might be addressed in a virtual space and how they might look different. And that just makes sense to us as brick and mortar teachers in that face-to-face kind of traditional setting. We know that we do those things in practice, but we are in a different modality. So we have to consider those things as well. I'm seeing people thinking through some science pieces that they're noticing. The teacher was able to make give some immediate feedback as students were engaging in the lesson. And really important, the small chunks. And Laura, I'm noticing folks are referring to how there was a gap in the learning that was clearly noted, and how May tried to weave that into a little mini lesson of sorts to fill that gap, to prepare the students for those heavy hitting skills that were coming down the road, that they really need to know that theme and really understand that piece.
Yeah, and really keeping in mind that although it's so important for us to really talk about this virtual modality with our teachers, and what ways are we going to be teaching, we don't want to lose sight of these real critical questions as we think through those virtual strategies. And that's what I love about the companion, is that those virtual strategies lay right next to those best practices. So remember, just to recap, we started off with really talking about how our intentional coaching starts with building that goal clarity with our teachers. Really talking to teachers about what students are going to learn, be able to know by the end of this lesson, and helping them to clarify that in their mind and really focusing on the planning. Then, as we watch teachers engage in these lessons, really thinking about which part of the lesson, or what is the teacher doing that is really positively impacting student achievement. And so in this particular lesson, many of you were able to catch some great things, some great strengths of May's lesson as we think about what she might be doing to positively impact student achievement. So now we want to move on to that third piece. As we think about it, how can we really focus on what the students are learning? So I'm going to go ahead and just refer us back to Sweeney. At the very beginning, we spoke about, I asked you to think about on a continuum where you feel, if you agreed or disagreed with these statements. And really, Sweeney talks about traditionally, coaching teachers has been about fixing them and paying attention to what they weren't doing and getting them to do the things that they weren't doing. But really, when we flip that and we make it about the student learning, it really changes the conversation. So now, more than ever, as teachers are focusing on this new virtual modality in teaching their students, we still want to make sure that they're focused on that student learning piece.
And Laura, here I love what they talk about, the sweet spot, really always taking into account the standards where our students are. Many of you responded to that just a moment ago, that you were noticing that it's really taking kids where they are and moving them to the next space and keeping them really focused on those things, those pre-skills, those prerequisites that they needed in order to be able to move towards mastery of that standard is key. So what are you thinking here, Laura?
So, that third piece, whenever we think about, as we're analyzing and thinking about what we saw in that particular lesson, it really leads us to this third piece, Vicki, which is, what is the right next step for May? Okay. So as an intentional coach, we want to be intentional with building that goal clarity with the teacher. We want to be intentional with looking at those instructional practices. And now we really want to think about what is the right next step for this particular teacher. So I want to share something with you from Brambrick and Santoyo, really thinking about the criteria for the right action step. And he sort of frames it into these three overarching pieces. That the right action step should be clear and measurable. The right action step should be bite-sized. And the right action step should have the highest leverage. And so intentional coaches don't focus on everything. They focus on something. And many of you who have had a chance to work with, you've often heard me say, in our quest to focus on everything, we often don't do anything. But in our quest to focus on something, we most likely will change that something. So I want us to think about May, and I want us to think about that lesson that we observed and think about this criteria for the right action step. And so, when I think about this lesson, the first thing that I want to think about is our NIT K-12 teaching standards. That really provides me with that shared common language. And it really allows me to think about that strength that May was able to exhibit. I'm going to have a conversation with her about the student learning and what students were able to learn, but I'm also going to focus it on that right next instructional practice for May. So when I think about May's strength, it was really presenting instructional content. And I'm looking at this companion tool, and I'm thinking about how she used the presentation of her content as a way to really engage students in thinking about that theme. And so I really want to bounce off of this. So I want you to really think about, you know, what might be the highest leverage next step for May? What would be a clear, measurable, and bite-sized next step? And I wish we were in a room where I could hear what you were saying. But because I can't, I want to go ahead and share some insights as to where I am thinking. And I want you to go ahead and capture what you might be thinking in regards to her next steps. But if May was really strong in that presenting instructional content and really capturing what her students were doing as she was listening to their thoughts on that theme and taking them through that conversation on guilt and using the details, really thinking about how in this particular lesson, the thinking can sometimes, that process can be invisible. And so trying to make that process more visible for May, the teacher, might be my very bite-sized next step. And so May was very, very clear about what she wanted them to learn, about their criteria. And she really focused on, at the beginning of that clip, having them self-assess where they felt comfortable. So I wonder, I'm just thinking of a bite-sized next step might be in the area of questioning, really getting the students to self-question instead of responding with answers, maybe even responding with questions, furthering questions for one another. It may allow May to see some insights into their thinking. That's just one bite-sized step that I could offer her. But remember, we're talking to you about this intentional coaching piece. So recapping those three components of intentional coaching. The first step is whenever you are talking to teachers, even in this virtual modality, that you're talking to them about the goals that students need to learn for that lesson. What are the goals for that lesson? The second piece is really paying attention whenever you're watching these lessons on what instructional practices are really impacting student achievement. And then that third step is choosing that effective practice that really is the right next step.
Agreed, Laura. I mean, there's a lot of insights. And you know, one of the things I think that teachers appreciate is always thinking about the strengths that are present in a lesson, because you know what, there's always strength in a lesson. And then from that strength, as Laura says, building on that to a bite-sized next step is a critical piece. I got so into the chat, and I apologize that my chat went before I meant for it to go, and I tried to finish it. Thank you for putting up with me on that. So as we reflect, I want you to think about what might be the impact of this process for intentional coaching in a virtual learning environment. Some of you were speaking about that on the chat, about the impact of this in an environment, a learning environment. So let's shift to there and think about how using these kind of tools can really help us to begin to impact our environment, our virtual environment, that is. You might want to send us a little chat as you reflect on that in the next moment or so.
So I really want us to spend a little bit of time as we think about what your next steps might be. You know, many of you, as you are sitting here thinking about, you know, what that next step for you as an intentional coach might look and sound like, those deliberate actions that you're going to take, how you're going to create a system where you are supporting teachers, especially in this virtual world. We were able to give you some tools today. For example, that virtual companion tool, handout 1, is a great tool for you to begin to use. Whether you are familiar with our NIT teaching standards, it is a great tool for you to think about and create that common language and segue and build bridges from what teachers are familiar with in the classroom to maybe a new area that they're not as familiar with, which is that virtual piece. That second tool that we gave you, which was in handout 3, which were those coaching questions, were those look fors. As we had you watching that planning coaching piece and watching the actual lesson, we had those critical questions, and those are critical, and you can use those. That's another tool that we've given you as you think about that intentional coaching piece. And then that last piece, when we talked about that bite-sized piece that you as a coach will think about in regards to bouncing off of that strength or building off of that relative strength that you see that teacher has, and really focusing on the students and not just the teacher pieces, but how can we as our teaching and learning impact students. So here are some examples of what some next steps might be for you as a result of your interaction in today's learning. For example, maybe you might implement a process for implementing ongoing learning walks, virtual or traditional at your school. What would a virtual learning walk look and sound like? And how can you use some of the tools that we described today to really further your conversations with your teachers to help enhance not just the teaching, but student learning as well?
And Laura, you know, the learning walk session, we'll be having one later this week that we'll be talking through. I think it's on Friday, if I'm not mistaken, that we'll really look at that and take a glimpse into that world of what that could look and sound like. But that is always something that helps teachers, just getting a little bit of feedback around what I'm doing, using those questions, as Laura said, what I'm doing and how I might strengthen that, are the strengths that are already present. People love to hear that. So those are some good things to think about, Laura, for sure.
Yeah. And that second piece is really just diving in with your leadership team. You know, maybe a next step for you might be diving in with your leadership team and focusing on that student-centered coaching, and making sure that we're not pulled into the only providing feedback to the teacher behaviors, but really providing feedback to how the students are learning and what that might look and sound like as we support them. So maybe that could be your next step. So I think it's really interesting for you to think about the context and of where you are and what your learning is and what might be a possible next step.
And Laura, we've been getting some other ideas as well about what folks might do using this tool and supporting teachers. You know, a lot of folks are also thinking about differentiation in the different kind of lessons that you teach, whether it be for EL or whatever it might be, different content areas. These are always great discussions, and these types of discussions and tools can help us to help each other during this time when it's kind of tricky. It's different. We're in that in-between space. And as Laura said, whether you use the NIT teaching standards rubric or use the Compass rubric or something else, this tool is definitely a keeper in terms of helping you kind of move forward in that conversation. So as we kind of start thinking a little bit, and folks are thinking about interactive tools and all these good things, keep those comments coming, just revisiting our session objectives. So today we talked a little bit of how to leverage this one tool, how to utilize it in our own teaching and in the teaching of our colleagues, whether we be teacher leaders or whether we be principals, administrators, or district leaders. This tool is helpful. And those conversations are super helpful. Understanding how teacher feedback can be used to enhance instruction, always a winner. We kind of illustrated that throughout, and also having that targeted teacher feedback and support in order to impact students. That's why we're really there. And so we want to, Laura and I, thank you today for your participation. And if you're interested, NIT has a lot of different resources. You can go to our website, NIT.org, and we have some additional webinars and tools that are super helpful in planning and instructing in a virtual space as well as in a face-to-face traditional space. We love y'all. We thank y'all for being here and working with us. Laura and I, we have never finished anything on time, so it is a good thing, Laura Riesel.
Yeah. And I know we have a lot of people, but we do have some time maybe on our chat tool to spend a little bit of time, really allowing those who are here maybe we won't be able to respond to all of them, but maybe opening it up to some chats. Just to kind of see where people might be in regards to where they are in their coaching and some questions they may have. So we'll go ahead and spend maybe the next 5 or 10 minutes and really just kind of sharing with you all. And so we'd love to hear from you. What are some takeaways? What are some next steps? And how you might see this new learning moving forward?
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys. How do we become a part of NIT? Our website has some additional information there for you. We partner with all kinds of institutions, districts, schools, and certainly have some opportunities there. And we'd love to partner with you as well, for sure. Laura, any other questions we're seeing come through?
I'll let my chat.
Spending a couple of moments. We don't want to leave without giving you an opportunity if you had another question or so, or wanted to share something. I see a lot of my friends. Thank you, friends. I see, Dr. Felicia Sledge Murphy. How are you? I miss you guys a bunch. And Catherine, it's funny. We see these folks we haven't seen in 100 years. Laura, I think it's because we're getting old, girl. But sure enough, it looks like a lot of our questions were definitely answered throughout the session, but certainly.
Yeah, Jody she says she's a coach, a master teacher for a district, and she's creating pre-made lessons and videos for all her teachers to use. And how will coaching look for these teachers? And I think that these questions, Jody, that we gave at the beginning are some great questions for you to use as your teachers, because a lot of times for pre-made lessons, teachers can feel like there's less ownership of that. And so I really feel like these questions that we used on handout 3 will allow you to spend some time maybe talking to the teachers about the intent of the lesson and what are the goals for the students. So I think that would be a great way for you to utilize that and begin to dive into those pre-made lessons. And these pre-made lessons are meant to support them. So I know they're going to appreciate that.
And Laura, what I'm doing is I'm responding to some of the questions that have come through in chat. I'm noticing that folks are asking questions about how long a virtual lesson might be, that synchronous part of the lesson. And that's an excellent question. Oftentimes it can vary from district to district how they approach that. Based on how well students are, able to access technology and different things, so it can look and sound different. And it's usually, from my knowledge, Laura, you might have some additional information, or someone who's still with us, about how those determinations are made.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a great question, and it goes back to the purpose, and that's really what the big takeaway for today is. The purpose is not just the teaching, the purpose is the learning. And so when we're being intentional in our coaching and we're being intentional about helping teachers to really dive into this new sort of realm, we don't want to lose sight of that. And so as a coach, that question might be different for the learners. And so just like we would say in the classroom, and most people say, well, that's how an attorney might answer that question, Laura, but it just depends on the learners. And I think if we as teachers keep our sights focused on what those learners need, then we can make adjustments to the length of the lesson. We might have to make adjustments to the interaction or the modality or the tools in that lesson. And so I really just think that those questions on that handout really serve as a great tool for you as a coach or as someone who's engaged in that discourse.
That's a good point, always. And some of the things that we do have out there as well are actually looking at different instructional practices and how that would look in a virtual setting as well. In fact, Laura did an excellent job with one in talking to some master teachers on their professional development that they're providing, and getting some insights into how we might support teachers even in that PLC kind of setting.
Yeah, so I think the big takeaway, as all of you are, I just appreciate all the work that all of you are doing, and the new learning that you're reaching for, and how you want to support your teachers. And I think I always like to remind people that you're coaching the reciprocal process of teaching and learning. You're not just coaching a teacher. And when you coach that reciprocal process, you really want to be intentional. You don't want it to be by chance, or, oh, today I asked a good question, but tomorrow I'm not sure what's going to happen. And I really promote those three things, which is coaching for goal clarity, making sure that you're staying focused on the aspects of the lesson that are giving the biggest bang for buck in regards to the student learning, and then also building off of strengths for teachers. And so as you move forward, thinking about these three steps and thinking about being deliberate and intentional as you coach, engaging in that, what the student learning should be, not just what the teacher practice should be. And I know our teachers and our coaches and our schools, when we enter the virtual modality, it can be very scary, but I think keeping everyone focused on our shared goal, which is making sure that our students leave with an understanding and new learning. If we stay focused there, then I think our intent in coaching is going to be, purposeful. So stay in that arena. But I have enjoyed being with you all today, and I have enjoyed your chats. I'm just going to check real quick before we leave, and where you can find some additional resources. And I hope that you're able to log in and join our 2 sessions that we will be having for the Teacher Leader Summit, and we have some great information to share. Thank you all so much. Y'all have a great day. Vicki, is there anything you want to say to our friends before we head out?
Just thank y'all so much for being with us today. And at NIT, we always want to help you. So just reach out to us at NIT Teach, and we're there for you. Y'all have a wonderful and blessed rest of your day. Bye, everyone.